Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Hi, we're here today with Author to Author with Sister Marysia Weber, RSM, who has written a very important book, I think, called Screen Addiction, Why You Can't Put That Phone Down. Welcome, Sister Marysia.
Thank you very much. Good to be with you, Cynthia.
Thank you. I'm glad you're here. Would you like to start us with a prayer?
Of course. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen.
Good and gracious God, you have given us a mind that has tremendous capacity for creativity. We beg you to guide our use of this great gift that you have given us for your good, that we bring everything we do to have you become a closer, more intimate reference in relationship in all we think and strive for. And during this hour, when we speak about screen addiction, please make this an aid to those who were not aware of some of the difficult effects of screen addiction, that with knowledge it will empower them to redirect their plans and actions, that it can be a tool to enrich minds, rather one that hinders the beautiful gift that you have given us in our mind. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Well, I have to say I'm very impressed with this book, Sister. I am a person who, I don't think I'm addicted to the screen, but I use the screen a lot in my work. And so I was very interested in reading this book. And I was hoping that we could go through it section by section, because there's a great deal of information in each one. Is that okay with you?
That would be fine.
Okay. So section 1, you start with youth and media, and when does digital use begin, and does it really matter? I was amazed, even on the first page, 44% of children under age 1 use a mobile device on a daily basis to play games, and that increases to 77% of 2-year-olds. That's amazing.
Yes.
So,
yes.
Surprising.
And you know, when you hear that some of the studies, they're finding, now this is not true for everyone, but there are some pockets of the population where the American Academy of Pediatrics, so this is a significant survey that was done, found that a number of parents are giving their 4-month-olds a digital device, almost as a pacifier in the crib, so to speak. And so they're getting a lot of visual stimuli that, of course, a 4-month-old cannot even process. Right. So when you think of that stimulating their visual center, and also more commonly today as well, the auditory center, what might that be doing to the developing brain that is not yet able to cognize and recognize with a capacity to synthesize and integrate this dispersed, diffuse, rapidly delivered sensory stimuli in a developing brain?
Yeah, it's kind of scary, to say the least. So I saw some of the effects that are in your book. The children who interact with screens talk later, and they talk less. Their social competence is affected. They have greater difficulty with conflict resolution. I mean, all kinds of problems that you never would think of as lasting over time when parents are just giving their children something that they think will occupy them.
Well, when you think about it, if you imagine a digital device, the most common one that a child can be given is a cell phone. It's small and easy to handle, yet for a child. So if you imagine children who are under the age of 2 being exposed to cell phones or smartphones in particular. And this is a population whose, statistics you've just recalled from my book. But so much of what is received is also passively received because the child does not interact with the data that they are receiving. So during these very important developmental years, it's said that the ages between 2 and 5 are very, very important for brain development. So if the first 2 years of life into age 5, before any formal schooling, they are receiving information that doesn't ask of them because it doesn't have the capacity to be interpersonal or interrelationship, it then makes them less engaged in developing their own vocabulary. And so that's why they end up talking less. And that's why they need to get a little bit older to hopefully be able to interact with adults. But even still, we see less face-to-face interactions. And so they're not used to listening to a conversation and then responding on topic to what is being said. And they're ready to go to something else because they haven't been formed in those early years to really develop conversational skills. And so, even as they get a little bit older, so now they're on the playground or they're outside in their neighborhood, because if they don't like something or they're bored by something, they shut it off. They know how to, sweep across their screen to something else. And painfully, these poor children, I believe, have become unwittingly, victims of then not knowing that, if you don't like somebody, you just don't turn them off, or you don't just cry because you don't get your own way. So they begin to treat one another like a gadget. One of our sisters worked at a university, also a philosopher herself, and she had her colleague come and bring their little girl as an infant, a just starting little girl. And then the next time she saw this little girl, who was maybe 10 months old, she already had a gadget in her hand. And the father was trying to get his little girl to pay some attention to our sister, who just was not interested. So she would say, I'll just call her Lucy. Lucy, here, sister, why don't you say hello? And this child was so much more interested in the gadget. And then when the father tried to take that away, the child, cried and just had this little, temper tantrum. And so what is it that we're, unintendedly creating in children if something gets taken away from them, rather than learning some self-regulation, which is so important for affective maturity? We're then letting the emotional component of who we are reign. It's almost like making that the foremost directing component of our being. Not only in early development, but sad to say we are seeing some of this in teenage years as well as in adult years. And we certainly know some of the ramifications of those kinds of behaviors where the emotionality is what predominates movement and actions rather than the intellect tempering the emotions to bring the will where it's more appropriate to direct one's thoughts and actions.
You mentioned also that empathy has found a significant drop in college students after the year 2000. So that would probably be in line with those first children that were given gadgets.
Well, even these studies, when you think of the cell phone, when was the cell phone first released to the general public? The iPhone?
Yeah.
What year?
Oh, I don't know, maybe early 90s?
I can tell you 2007. So,
really? I'm way off.
So that's okay. That's okay. So 2007 is when the iPhone was first released. But when you hear already in 2000, as a medical doctor, as a physician, and then I was asked to go on to do a residency and fellowship in psychiatry at the Mayo Clinic. After I finished my training at the Mayo Clinic and began to see patients, I graduated from the Mayo Clinic after a fellowship in 1991. Now, this was before, certainly far before the cell phone, but even shortly after the World Wide Web was released, because the World Wide Web became available in 1991. So it wasn't used much. But I began to see in my own patients, as the years evolved, some changes in their behaviors. And they were coming to me for concerns related to their overuse of electronic media. And this was not, the case. So doing a lot of assessments for religious life, for seminaries, for a variety of job description, job opportunities as well as universities, I began to see in my work a decline in the scales of empathy and an incline or an increase in the scales of narcissistic traits, not a narcissistic personality disorder, but just more self-focus. And as I did more research and would go to my professional meetings, I found that some of my other colleagues who were taking a greater interest in electronic media use as well were finding the same things. So this 2000 is at a time when we're seeing a lot more of, Facebook becoming more popular. So what do you do with Facebook or MySpace or some of the earlier ones? You build a profile. So you try to create a persona that may or may not even be who you really are like, but you build a picture of yourself. And so you're more interested in how you come across than who you really are. And these social media applications make that very possible. So, it's not the only thing that has created this, but it is something that has contributed to less empathy, less sense of being able to care for another or wonder about how another is thinking and feeling, because there's far fewer face-to-face interactions and much more electronic interactions, which is much more impersonal.
Right. You also mentioned some of the things that are going on with adults, like sleeping with their phones. I've been guilty of that. But also how it affects the quality of our sleep, irritability, impaired school or work performance because of the blue spectrum light of the cell phone.
Surely, yes. Well, we can say now that 2/3 of Americans suffer from sleep deprivation. And that was not something that was the case before electronic media became available, but now especially the smartphones. So now we're moving forward towards 2007 and forward. And though the statistics, I think, are low because it's hard to really get now an accurate number, but still, it's thought that 65 to 75% of adults sleep with their phone. And that about 75 to 85% of teens sleep with their phone, and that most of these teenagers especially check their phones in the middle of the night. So if you think that many of them are checking their phones in the middle of the night, they're having disrupted sleep patterns, what is called sleep architecture. So the blue light is far less a concern today because many of the iPhone companies, smartphones, have made accommodations so that when it's nighttime, then they use a light that doesn't stimulate as much the blue light that was the problem before. But the early studies were done with the blue light. But for example, God created us so beautifully. We have in our brain what is called the pineal gland. And the pineal gland, when it gets dark, tells our brain that it's getting time now to go to sleep. And so the pineal gland releases a chemical called melatonin, which is the body's natural sleep aid, which helps us get a little bit sleepy and fall asleep. Well, when with this blue light, people are taking their phones and checking their cell phone messages, or especially playing these online games and things like that, it's telling them, that, it's telling your brain, it's not nighttime, it's still, awake time. And so it was really affecting the circadian rhythms or the sleep architecture, and then affecting the restfulness with which persons felt in the morning. Now, because these smartphones have accommodated with the light, it's still a problem because of the dings and the buzzes and whatever else tells you that you've gotten a message, or you might even wonder if anybody's responded to your message, even though they might not even get a sound, to see what somebody has said to you, or where the latest game is on your online game, what the players are doing, what the score is on a sports online game that you've engaged in, such that it is still disrupting the sleep for different reasons, but because of the interaction and the sounds that are now associated with it. So yes, you are absolutely correct. It is causing difficulties in the circadian functioning, which was not the case, of course, before the smartphones became available.
Sure. So we'll see what happens over more time as we all get older, those of us who have been doing this. That's scary. One of the other topics that you talk about in this first section is sexting. And, of course, some of the more harmful consequences of cell phone use would certainly be that, especially for the young. So you do talk about that, and cyberbullying and sex trafficking.
Yeah.
So would you like to mention some of those things?
Surely. The sexting, for those who are not aware, is sending or posting or receiving nude or semi-nude text messages, pictures, or videos of yourself. And this is an increasing incidence among teenagers. And some of the later statistics, again, some of these are hard to get exactly, but it'll give you kind of a ballpark. It's said that 22% of teenage girls send or post a nude or semi-nude picture or video of themselves. And 18% of teenage boys do so. So wanting to look at this, they wanted to see, well then, with maturing age and becoming more adults and getting to college and trying to be more responsible, how much would these percentages change in this sexting? And I always like to ask, what do you think the percentage is that now that they're young adults between ages 20 and 26? And, since you have your book in front of you, my book in front of you, you could answer that. But I have in the book that, to the surprise of many, that women who are now young adults who sext goes from 22% in teenage girls to 36% in young adult women, which is a huge increase. And 18% of teenage boys rises to 31% of young adult males, which is a concerning thing because, as you well know, once something is in cyberspace, it's just not possible to eliminate it. You can eliminate it from your phone, your computer, your social media sites, but it's out there. I, in fact, have had some teenagers as patients who have Googled themselves and sometimes have found their picture. There's one dear teenager, she was suffering with a little bit of anxiety, a little depression, and when she Googled her name, she found herself with just the upper part of herself. She had a bikini on, and it wasn't, that revealing, although it was a little bit of a seductive stance, on the invitation to a lesbian party. This young girl was not lesbian at all. Mm-hmm. And so she was a bit surprised that her picture had been co-opted and put on an invitation really without her knowledge, much less her permission. So that was a bit of a wake-up call for her.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, scary. And, of course, I think my impression, anyway, is that many of the colleges and even future employers do now Google people's names and see what their social media is. So it's something that can have an impact on them for a long time after.
Well, because now there's so many applicants, and sometimes it's hard to be able to discern who you're going to take just based on grades or based on letters of recommendation or, activities they would have gotten involved in. So if they have to make a decision, and it's kind of a difficult one, they will access the social media sites and see what someone has posted and take at least a guess as to the level of affective maturity of the person, and then decide maybe one over another to accept, either to a college or to a future employment. So yes, that's definitely the case.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Then you also talk about cyberbullying.
Yeah, that's a sad situation. Bullying is bad enough, but teens who are being cyberbullied is on the increase. The numbers are always ballpark because it's getting harder and harder to get a whole U.S. expanse, where there's one survey that gets all the statistics. But the reports indicate that between 20 to 40% of teenagers are cyberbullying, and that 50% or more never tell their parents that they're being cyberbullied. And so when persons have been asked why you seem so distressed about this, understandably, to be told you're ugly, that you should die, that nobody likes you, is devastating, especially during the teenage years. You're just trying to develop who you are and what you're about. It's a rough time as it is. Yeah. But teens say that they are less inclined to say anything because in order to get away from their tormentor, who they may not even know who this person is. This is what is the difference between a bully and a cyberbully. Because a cyberbully, it may be somebody you know, or maybe somebody you don't even know. And for them to avoid that cyberbully, they have to give up their phone. And they don't want to give up their phone. And so then the cyberbullying continues. So this cyberbullying has much deeper ramifications than if it was a face-to-face bully on the playground where, a teacher can intervene and a parent can intervene and something more could happen to hopefully educate both on how to address this in a more appropriate manner. The boundaries of being able to do that are no longer available in the same way because of the internet and the processes that I've just described.
You also mentioned sex trafficking, which seems to really up the ante, although with the cyberbullying, of course, there is the possibility of suicide, but sex trafficking also, that's a hardcore problem.
Oh, that's really on the increase, very sadly. Because it's so available now and so hard to track. Backpage was one of the main ones a couple of years ago that they were trying to take down because it was one of the major industries for sex trafficking of teenagers. And it's only President Trump in about 2017, 2018, that he put into effect laws against sex trafficking. And it was also at around that time that Farrar, the CEO of Backpage, finally admitted to laundering prostitution and really victimizing individuals through that page. The difficulty, though, with, again, the internet is you can just create another name. So this URL is taken down, or some credit card companies refuse to allow anything to be purchased when it's a purchase from Backpage, for example. Then many, many others come up that have maybe benign-sounding names that you don't even know that it's a sex trafficking site. And sex trafficking is grown to be an industry that now is almost the second most lucrative industry in the United States and other parts of the world, along with drug trafficking, because, of course, drugs and sex trafficking go hand in hand.
Sure.
And it used to be third because gun trafficking used to be up there, but it surpassed the sale of guns. So it's something to really educate persons about, and it's much more common than we're aware, and there's a lot that's being done. There's tremendous websites to look up as to what might be some of the signs of persons who are frightened, who feel vulnerable, that are alienated, that are groomed, that you can have a place where these individuals can be reached out to and assisted, because they prey on the vulnerable in ways that we would never, ever think. And they have other teenagers sometimes in the schools who have been sex trafficked and get other, quote, friends to join them at parties, where then they end up getting into this horrible spiral of really painful and devastating behaviors.
Okay. Alrighty. In Section 2, you talk about screen addiction. And that's an interesting concept that you can, when you talk about the rat study, that's fascinating to me. So this pleasure center, I guess, is tied into that. Would you like to talk about that a little bit?
Well, as a psychiatrist now for about 35 years, we never anticipated that something that you look at on a screen could become so addictive. Because when we think of an addiction, mental health professionals have certain, criteria for an addiction. Something needs to be, you need to develop a tolerance to it. Tolerance is that I need more of the same substance. For example, if I've never had a glass of wine and I have my first glass of wine, I feel tipsy. And I might need to have a glass of wine every day for 2 weeks, for example, before I might need a little bit more wine to have the same effect. So I'm becoming tolerant to the same chemical. I need more of it to feel a little tipsy. So that's tolerance. Then also, in order to have something that's been an addiction, you need also withdrawal. So if I don't have the substance, then I might have, a little bit of shakes, my pulse might raise, my blood pressure might raise. I can be maybe a little bit even irritable, something that you would see in somebody who suffers with alcoholism.
Sure.
So that's something that's taken in your mouth. You drink it, or even IV drugs, for example, crack cocaine. But we never thought that something that you're just looking at could become addictive.
Right.
So this was quite an unexpected effect. That something that would have used the most sensitive sense that we have, our eyes, would then affect the brain to create an addiction that actually is now touted to be one of the most addictive addictions there is. Some of these screen-mediated addictions, especially pornography, but even some of these other online games that have become addictive. And so when you think of it using our most sensitive sense and then beginning to affect how the brain works, it really is something to pause about and really consider how we are using electronic media. The tremendous benefits from social media, but in excess or indiscriminately used, it can create addictions that we need to get a better handle on and treat because of the profound ramifications in the psychosocial behaviors as well as the neurochemical effects on the brain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. This gaming section I found very interesting, that people would actually spend the amazing amounts of time that you're talking about in doing something like this World of Warcraft and
yes,
some of these others. But apparently people miss work. They don't go to class. It's amazing to think of something that I would think of as a pastime, something that I could do for a little bit of fun, and even skipping meals, very, very interesting section here on the screen addiction as tied to online gaming. So,
yeah, I think maybe if I step back a little bit and look at some of the basics of neuroanatomy, our brain is just jam-packed with over 100 billion cells, and it contributes to 100 trillion operations per second. Now, if somebody doesn't believe in God, how can all that happen with my just standing here and all that activity going on? Even as we're talking, the cilia in my ears are moving and getting the little inner bones in my ears to create the sound that I can understand, and my heart is beating, and my liver is processing, all these little metabolites that I don't need anymore. I mean, so much is going on.
Sure.
And so when we look at the pleasure center, which is kind of the seat of where these addictions evolve, the pleasure center is in literally almost in the central part of the brain, where dopamine is synthesized and then released to other parts of the brain. And dopamine is kind of the little pleasure neurotransmitter. And the brain needs dopamine to function properly. And when we have, the company of a good friend, it'd be a spritz of dopamine. Or when we're enjoying a good meal, it might be a spritz of dopamine. Or we're contemplating, things of God, it can be a spritz of dopamine. Or even exercise. But there are also certain things that cause pleasures that when there's in excess, that's when we get the problems with addiction. So if I tie also then the prefrontal cortex, which is the part on top of my eyes, that part of the brain that sits on top of my eyes, that's called the prefrontal cortex, or the site for executive functioning, or what St. Thomas Aquinas would call the intellect. Now, if I were able to show you a picture of my brain in the center where the dopamine is synthesized, then there's a pathway that goes all the way to the prefrontal cortex that sends messages to that part of the brain that then needs to determine, it's the part of the brain that judges, that plans, that reflects, and integrates what's coming at me. So if there's too much stimulation to the pleasure center, then that prefrontal cortex, that part of the brain above my eyes, will send a message to the center of the brain and say, enough release of dopamine. No more pleasure to be stimulated. So that prefrontal cortex is really the self-regulation part of the brain. But we have discovered that with electronic devices that are overused, this has created a dysfunction in the prefrontal cortex. So it does not allow the prefrontal cortex to inhibit more release of dopamine. It's overridden it. And that's what has created, this addiction that we didn't anticipate seeing. Now, Marshall McLuhan is really the first one to describe why this is so, and I think this is an important factor. He was a pioneer in the effects of television on the brain. And he noted that it's really the medium delivering the message that plays a more significant role in changing the brain function than the content of the message. So in other words, it's more the rate and volume at which the images are delivered through the eyes and the ears that have a stronger significance on the brain than watching TV. So when you think of this high-speed internet, it's the rate at which all these images are stimulating the pleasure center much faster. Like if you were to look at great beauty in a book, if you flip through those pages really quickly, you'd see nothing.
Right.
But with the internet, a lot of images could be sent to the cones and rods of your eyes. And even though you may not integrate them, you're still getting the visual stimulation in your brain. So it's not the beauty of the pictures, it's the mechanism through which those pictures are being sent to your brain that has a more powerful effect. So it's this high-speed internet that's creating the addictive quality that we're seeing both in online gaming and also in internet pornography.
So the images themselves, though, because you're getting so many of them, that's giving you the addiction to the pornography, or giving you the addiction?
Yes.
Yes.
It's not just the images themselves. We know online gaming. Well, the kids have played a lot of games, and they were never addicted in the way they are addicted now because of, number one, they're interactive, and they're high speed. And so both the high speed of those stimuli to the visual center and the auditory center, stimulating the pleasure center, such high speed creates a lot more hyperarousal, which is then contributing to the addictive process. And that's why you're seeing irritability or withdrawal if you're not continuing to play the game. That's why these persons are drawn to keep playing the game, even though they do it less for pleasure, but because they don't want to have the irritability that they feel from the withdrawal symptoms of not playing the game or not viewing internet pornography.
So if someone is looking at, say, perversion pornography, as opposed to, not that I'm saying pornography is right, but, a particular kind of bad pornography, like maybe something mean, if they see that a lot, they're becoming addicted to that particular kind of image because they see so much of it so quickly? Is that what you're saying?
Pretty much, yes. But what happens that is different with an addiction to the internet that is not the case with an addiction to alcohol or an addiction to crack cocaine, for example, is a process called desensitization. Because if we then take pornography, for example, that can be sexually arousing, after a while, the same images, even many images, the brain becomes dull to them, in part because it gets overwhelmed, so it begins not to respond. This is when the pleasure center is saying, this is enough. I can't take any more.
Okay.
But in order to still get the stimulation, because they don't like to go into withdrawal, then what pornographers have done is they couple both something that is violent with sex, because something that has violence in it, can stimulate, adrenaline, because it gets you kind of frightened. And so it's more stimulating. And that's what pornographers have had to do in order to get persons to keep watching their material. in order that the person still get that high from viewing pornography. So sadly, then persons then when they think of violence, what do they think of?
Sex.
Yeah. And when they think of sex, what do they think of? Violence. And so there becomes an association with something that really has nothing to do with that. And this is where the neuroscientists have made use of what is called operant conditioning. So if you remember your high school psychology, do you remember Pavlov's dogs?
Oh, sure.
Okay. So what did Pavlov do? He set down food for the dogs and rang a bell. Set down food for the dog and rang the bell. And did that again. And then the dogs would salivate when the food was set down and he was ringing the bell. Then, after many trials of this, then he didn't put down the food, but he rang the bell. And what did the dogs do?
They salivated.
They salivated at the ringing of the bell. So these dogs became conditioned to associate ringing of the bell with food. And that's what very much the neuroscientists have done. They have deliberately created some of these social media sites and these games to be addictive. If we think back to Facebook, when Facebook first came out, what was it? It was intended to be just kind of like a passive but electronic directory of persons in college, for example. So it just had the picture and their name. So it was a very passive kind of social media site. And Mark Zuckerberg was aware of experiments that were done in the 70s by psychologists with pigeons. And he noted that when he dropped pellets of food at unpredictable times, then that secreted more dopamine in the pigeons. And then the pigeons then would anticipate the pellets to come down, not knowing when they would come down, but be much more attentive to wanting to look for the pellets. So Mark Zuckerberg then asked these neuroscientists to do something very similar, which is intermittent positive conditioning.
Sure.
So once the like button came out, persons on Facebook, they didn't know if they were going to get a like for their post. And if they did get a like, they wanted to, go in again and see who looked at their post and what they liked about it and try to get more followers. Then all the other social media apps began to use the same thing, such that now there's the ding and the buzz, that is, it's the operant conditioning. So now we associate dings and buzzes with maybe somebody is responding to my post, as well as the unpredictability that we didn't anticipate of when it was going to come. And both those factors have had an effect on creating an addictive quality to electronic media. You see how this was not the case with drinking alcohol or even shooting up with cocaine. It's a very different process that goes right at the neural circuitry of the brain. So, unfortunately, this is where the creativity of the human mind has done something to create addictions, which is not always, a positive thing, but it's certainly gotten many persons very rich at the heels of other persons becoming addicted to some of these games and gadgets that are available across the generations.
I'm just curious, if somebody looks at porn and then they somehow associate that with violence and they become addicted to it, does that translate into the real world?
Studies have shown that persons who become addicted to pornography, then when they are out in the world, they seek things that are very seductively pornographic. And so even teenagers who are dating, there's much more reports of dating being much more violent or aggressive because of the images that they've seen. And the girls who have been exposed to their friends looking at internet pornography somehow expect this or think this is normal. We've had more wives complain of this, although there's an increasing number of women who are also looking at internet pornography, but wives who complain that their husbands are more distant when they're having intimate relations, and that they're imagining the imagery that they saw on their pornography sites. And so it's becoming a real dehumanizing experience where there's a lack of intimacy that's really felt more often by the spouses, more often than the wife. And so sadly, yes, there's an increased aggression in sexual activity that we're seeing amongst many, many populations, married and unmarried, and also the younger generation, thinking that this is normal. And the drive to do this has become pretty strong because of some of the effects that the pornography has had on their understanding of what it is to be intimate, which is really a dysfunctional way of expressing intimacy, as we well know.
Mm-hmm. Boy, that's not good. That's an understatement, I guess. But I teach theology of the body, John Paul II theology of the body, online, both at the undergraduate and graduate level. And I think back to where he addresses in the theology of body the use of art, and that's something that I think I'm going to have to bring that into my courses. That's pretty interesting, pretty scary stuff that you're talking about.
Since I've been doing presentations on internet pornography for the past, I don't know, maybe 20 years now, every year I look up statistics, and every year sex is the number one search topic on the internet.
Wow.
And even though the numbers, again, don't increase very much each year, again, it'll give you just a sense as to how frequent some of these search engine requests are. And this is, years ago, but still 68 million daily pornographic search engine requests in the U.S. And it said that 40 million adults in the U.S. view internet pornography regularly, and 10% admit to being addicted to internet pornography. And we know that persons who admit to an addiction are low. Most persons deny that they're addicted. So this number is actually much higher. And I do a lot of assessments for a variety of reasons. And in some of the studies that I've looked up, we have found that about 65% of college men and maybe 20 to 25% of college women spend time online for internet sex every week. And so it's through the webcam that they're having virtual sex.
Oh, my. Which
is not something that we saw 25, 30 years ago before the internet even was available. It's also said that persons who recover from internet pornography addiction report being more social and less anxious and have an increased productivity and a greater desire to engage in real-life romantic relationships, which is really beautiful. But the tragedy is this is what internet pornography robs persons of those very normal relational experiences that God created us to have with one another, and also, with Him, that intimacy with Him.
Okay. In Section 5, you changed to is electronic media making us smarter? And I found some of the things you talk about, laptops in the classroom, what our schools, I guess, should and could do. Would you like to talk about that a little bit?
Surely. Today, not uncommonly, more college students are taking laptops, to take class notes And though that's a reasonable thing to do, what teachers, even those who teach informational sciences, even those who are IT people, or communications, have found that it's more difficult to teach class with the students who are using laptops because they're also doing many other things and not just paying attention to the lecture. So they might be checking their social media sites. They may be, on eBay purchasing something. They're checking their email and going back to the PowerPoint. And so it's a challenge. And so some groups have actually done studies of testing individuals shortly after an exam, after a lecture, to see how they have performed. The most significant study that has been done is by West Point, and they had an economics course of sophomore cadets, and they divided the students into those who only used a laptop to take notes for the class, another group that could use a tablet or something if they wanted to, and then another group that only handwrote notes. And at the end of the semester, with tests in between, they studied which group did the best on pop quizzes. And they found that those who had handwritten notes got better scores and were integrating information after a course than those who were using their digital devices to take notes. And so they were looking at possibly why that is. And, not surprisingly, when you reflect on when you take notes, we can type pretty fast when we get used to a keyboard, and it doesn't take all our attention. So some of this becomes more automatic, and it takes more effort to handwrite notes because we can't handwrite as fast as we can type. So when we're handwriting classroom notes, then we're already beginning to look at for main points, maybe summarizing, beginning to integrate a little bit as we write down the information. So there's already an integrative process that's being initiated when we're just taking handwritten notes. Then if we're maybe just typing notes, where there's also the temptation to do other things as well as just more automatically type. Now, some of this, you can also say that somebody who is just typing notes is paying less attention, and somebody who is handwriting notes paying more attention. That generally is the case. But you can also have somebody who's really paying attention while they're trying to type. But they've done also shorter studies where they have found that even somebody who's really trying to pay attention and typing notes, that those who are sitting around them in a big lecture hall where the lights kind of flash and change as their neighbors maybe are changing their attention to maybe a social media site or their emails or whatever, that just the changes in the lighting is a little bit distracting. That was not as so it was the person who was really trying to concentrate taking notes wasn't as aware that some of this is being distracting them. So they did studies where some were on laptops just intently taking notes, and those on laptops intently taking notes with those around them using their laptops however they chose. And they found that those who were surrounded by others who went to other sites actually did less well on pop quizzes as well. So it has a distractive feature that may not be appreciated as much. So some universities are even considering having no laptops in their lectures. That's not a real popular kind of protocol, but some lecturers have asked that of their students and part of their class. And certainly more in grade schools, you see that in some high schools, you see that more the Catholic schools are asking that cell phones be dropped off and not be in the classroom at all, because they have found that there is better education taking place when that's the case.
That's interesting. That's not something I ever would have thought of. but just the lights flashing around you, disturbing you, and somebody else not paying attention is actually causing you to do poorly on work.
I notice that more when I'm on an airplane traveling, to maybe a presentation, for example, and I like to read a book, but not atypically somebody beside me or across the aisle from me is watching a movie on their laptop, more commonly their iPad, and sometimes their iPhone. And just the flashing of the same change of sceneries is distracting when I'm trying to read my book. And so sometimes I find myself just trying to turn my head a little bit away so it doesn't get into my peripheral vision. So I'm very aware of it myself in those kinds of situations.
Okay. In Section 6, you turn to something more positive, engaging the human genius to create apps that promote neurocognitive health rather than those that would become addictive. So some positive here. Maybe you could say a few things about that.
Sure. And I just want to underscore that I am not suggesting that electronic media or smartphones are bad. I mean, they are wonderful tools. They allow individuals to access information that wouldn't be possible if, you were a smaller town. My mother, who suffered with Alzheimer's, was able to speak and see her sister in France because of, FaceTime that wouldn't have been possible at all, and that was really important to her. So there's wonderful uses for it. So again, I want to underscore that, because sometimes when persons ask me about the negative effects, then I think, oh my gosh, but no, it's a very good tool when used with moderation and for purposes that enhance and promote our human dignity. Getting to what you're referring to in the book, there are institutes that really want to focus on developing apps or gaming devices that harness the captivating characteristics of technology that actually would foster healthy development. And one such facility is at UC Davis called the Medical Investigation of Neurodevelopmental Disorders, or the MIND Institute. And they are really looking at trying to develop some video games specifically aimed at enhancing the cognitive abilities of somebody who suffers with attention deficit disorder, for example. And this Dr. Simon, who's one of the main researchers, speaks of that commercially built games or even educational tools can build skills, but they don't build what he calls capacity. And I think this is an important distinction. So he says, for example, you can flip a coin 100 times, and you can get really good at flipping a coin 100 times, but it doesn't help you play the piano. So you're doing this one skill, but you're not building a capacity to do things that are integrating. And so his coworkers are working at developing these games or these applications that actually help the cognitive capacity of those who have trouble attending, who have attention deficit disorder. And I think this would be a wonderful way to develop these applications. So much research yet needs to be done, and it's in its pilot state. This, quote, digital medicine has a lot of hope for those children, because right now the main way to treat attention deficit is through stimulants or other medications that can have side effects like, just a shortening of height or sleep problems or appetite problems, which is the best we can do right now, as well as some behavioral interventions. So I think this is very important. And they're also trying to look at other mental illnesses. They're trying to also look at those who have had brain injuries that would help them develop motor skills that were injured by a head injury. So that I think is kind of exciting.
Yeah, I agree with you that there's many positive things that can come from this technology. Much technology, I think, is neutral, but it's how we use it that has the impact.
Excuse me.
Go ahead.
And I said, there's also a lot being done to study the untoward or the not helpful effects of digital media. There's one of the largest studies being done today. It's called the ABCD study, and that's the Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development Study that was initiated by the National Institute on Drug Abuse and National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism, which is supported by many, many other study groups. Right now, it's following almost 12,000 youth who are between the ages of 9 and 10, and amongst this 12,000 include 2,100 of whom are twins and triplets, and they're going to follow these individuals throughout their adult lives. So this is a landmark study on brain development and child health. They're looking at advanced neuroimaging to really observe brain development in these children throughout their adolescence, while also tracking their social, behavioral, physical, and environmental factors and how this may affect their brain development and other health outcomes. It's been conducted across 21 research sites around the country. They've already done a study looking at the MRI scans of brains of 4,500 9 to 10-year-olds who were the heaviest electronic device users, and also some children who spent 2 or more hours a day on screens. And they found that in this group of individuals, they had lower memory as well as lower language scores. But what they're saying, and I think it's very important to say, is they don't know yet whether the time spent on digital devices is the primary cause of these effects. And if not, what are the contributors of these effects? So what came first, the chicken or the egg? And it's going to take years to answer some of the questions, but an added challenge with electronic devices is that by the time some of the answers are proposed by the current technology, which is the new technology, then newer technology will replace what, they've come to better understand. So it's always a little bit of a chase to get at this. And so I think a more prudent and more effective route to go is all things in moderation.
Oh, yes. I agree. I like this quotation you have in here of Pope Francis in the 2016 World Communication Day message, where he said, the Internet is something truly good, a gift from God. And I think that is true. It is just something that needs to be used with caution, as does anything. Moderation is a good word there. So very good.
Yeah, so that becomes a network. So to become a network not of wires, but of people. I think that's just
of people. Key. Of people connecting people. Yeah.
Yeah, but we're created for relationship. God, we're created to know and be known, to love and be loved. That's why God created us. First and foremost, Him, but also those that He places in our lives. And so that's just such an important element that we cannot have a greater relationship with a cell phone, because that won't make us feel loved or cared about or known. It's only that human person. It's only through relationship that great dignity of who we are, creating God's image and likeness, can be made manifest and experienced personally and interpersonally.
Yeah, my husband and I have a long-distance relationship. I live here in Connecticut where I work, and I'm home in Vermont with him on weekends. But because of the cell phone, I can call him when I get to the grocery store and I'm walking through the aisles, or I can call him when I just get to the office so that he knows what I'm doing. So we end up talking about 20 times a day using the cell phone. And that really does enable us to continue our relationship even though we're 3.5 hours away.
Wonderful.
So, there really are many, many positive things that we need to be aware of also. And certainly relationship-wise, my kids and grandkids, they're all over the place. But I can always just pick up the cell phone and talk to them. Granted, I could do that with a telephone too, but I have to be at my desk or at a phone to do that, as opposed to wherever I am. I can just call them.
Sure.
So it's very positive. Your last section, number 7, you talk about the need for joy for emotional maturity. And I like that you talk about St. Thomas, who states that the 3 interior effects of charity are joy, peace, and mercy. Would you like to talk about that a little bit?
Do we have time?
I do. If you do, it's fine.
Surely.
I don't
know
if you do. Sure.
Yes.
Go ahead. Mm-hmm.
So the 3 interior effects of charity, as St. Thomas would say, are joy, peace, and mercy. And, in order for us to really experience that relational aspect of being known and being loved, unless we have that, we won't have joy, because it's also joy that stimulates the growth of the brain in a way that helps us form who we are and what we're about. Joy is a glad being together. It's relational. Joy is found in smiles and play and love, and it's equally powerful when there are also painful states. We can feel keenly if a friend is rushed to the emergency room, and we waited to see whether or not a loved one would survive, and we weep with relief. Even if it's not a good outcome, but just to have somebody else there with us helps us know that there's someone there sharing a moment and that they're glad to be with us. And it's got to be relational. We are created for relationship. And without that, then we won't have that sense of being, human in the dignity that God created us for. I think, going back to St. Francis, that this be a connection of people and not of wires, because I think what is so key in that experience of joy is to raise our eyes, to truly be successful in our lives. We need to look into the eyes of another person and see someone worthy of love. That brings us joy. And also to raise our own eyes, to receive the gaze of another upon us. And without that, then, they're just, we lose hope, and it brings us to sorrow and pain, and ultimately to some levels of despair. So we need to reclaim joy. We need to reclaim the relational aspect. And joy is only through relationship.
Yes, I agree. Very beautifully said. Was there anything else that you wanted to add before we close?
I think that's pretty much, it. I think that another aspect that we need is also silence. I think that for affective maturity to take place, there needs to be a balance of integrated thoughts and values. But, even Cardinal Sarah talks about the need for silence. We know now that silence is necessary for brain development and integration, which we didn't really know before. There are studies that were done by a researcher really on rats, and it found that she was looking at just when there was music being played, and then when she moved the electrodes during a time of silence, realized there was a lot of activity going on in the rats' brains. So we now know that silence helps build the neurons in the brain. It also helps integrate material, allows the neurons to connect together to allow some kind of reflection. It also helps us let go of stress and allows us to process information. So those are tremendous benefits of silence. And I think today, to develop a taste for prayer is probably one of the first and foremost battles of our age. And our God our world no longer hears God because it's constantly speaking, at a devastating speed and volume, often in order to say nothing. He would say that modern civilization doesn't know how to be quiet. It holds forth kind of an ongoing, unending monologue. He even calls it the dictatorship of verbal emphasis, of social media. And he also has another quote that I really like, that he says that the power of silence, it just means not interrupting someone, but he talks about that interior silence, that quiet. And I think that's where we talk about the interior effects of charity, of peace, joy, and mercy. When I think of peace, I think of that interior silence. And he would say that without silence, God disappears in the noise. And this noise becomes all the more obsessive because God is absent, which I thought is a profound statement. So if we don't have enough quiet, then we can't hear or experience the presence of God. And when God disappears because of all the noisiness, then we become all the more obsessive, almost looking for him because God is absent. And I think that is such a profound insight that we receive from Cardinal Sarad in his book, The Power of Silence.
Beautiful.
Yeah, so it's important to let the Holy Spirit penetrate our innermost regions of our soul, because it's in that secret space that God lives and acts. And he works so much to achieve union with us. And as long as we don't recognize, that great silence of God in the depths of our own heart, and seek to understand that mysterious place of the eternal, especially in his flesh as we await the incarnation, the beautiful mystery of the incarnation. There's not a way for us to really be truly, spiritually, humanly transformed and divinized. We're so invited to become more divinized or more Christ-like. And I think this Advent season, is such a powerful invitation to ponder these mysteries. The antiphons are so rich. Today being wisdom as we continue on up until, Christmas Eve. And then the beautiful feast of our incarnation of our Lord.
I agree. Well, I have to say, sister, that this has been a very delightful interview for me. I enjoyed reading your book. I think it's an important book. I'm certainly going to be suggesting it in a couple of my classes. And I thank you very much for taking this time to talk with me.
Well, it's my joy and pleasure. And please refer them to the En route Books and Media website and page. There's also a brief 5.5-minute video that is animated and gives an excellent description of some of the neurophysiology that I've described and how the addictive process evolves. That I think is very useful. And also on that page are free downloadable discussion booklets that are age appropriate for parents, young adults, and teens, that have discussion questions, that also have some tips and suggestions, as well as some references that can be useful for ongoing discussion. I've had many Catholic schools, different youth groups, parishioners access them and have given positive feedback. So I'm very grateful for that, and grateful to En route Books for having published and put that material available for those who so desire.
Thank you very much for letting me know about that. I will make sure that I do direct my students to that. So, again, I thank you very much for the interview.
Well, it's been a pleasure speaking with you. God bless you. May this rest of Advent and Easter and New Year's be filled with many graces and great joy.
For you also.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
Goodbye.
Yep, bye-bye.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.